Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in 1 Corinthians. We're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 14. We began with this chapter yesterday. Paul is still giving us instructions on spiritual gifts. And in this chapter, he's focusing primarily on the gifts of tongues and of prophecy. These are the two most highly valued gifts, it seems, in the Corinthian church. They were widely practiced, it seems. And so Paul wants to give some instructions. And everything he says, there's kind of an interplay between speaking in tongues or languages you have not naturally learned and prophesying, speaking the word of the Lord in a powerful way. Now, Paul places greater value, we're going to see this, on prophecy. Because remember, the underlying assumption of chapter 14 is that gifts are to benefit the whole church. And you want to exercise your gifts in such a way that the whole church is benefited. We're talking about gatherings for worship. So notice how he connects these two as he talks about tongues and prophecy. Start reading in verse 2. For he says, "For anyone who speaks in a tongue, he does not speak to people, but to God. Indeed, no one can understand them, for they utter mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and their comfort. So anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. For the one who prophesies is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless someone may interpret, so that the church may be edified." Notice the example Paul is using. When you gather for church and someone is speaking in tongues, they're under the power of the Spirit, they're uttering mysteries to God, but since they are speaking in a language that is not naturally known to the congregation, no one benefits except the one who is speaking or who is uttering the tongues. Now that person is benefited, that their spirit grows in worship, but it is a private exercise. So they're not benefiting the whole church. On the contrary, Paul says, the one who is prophesying is speaking the word of the Lord in a way everyone can understand, and so the whole church is edified. And so Paul places greater value on the one who prophesies in public worship because the whole church is edified, rather than the one who speaks in a tongue, who is individually edified and strengthened, but it does not benefit necessarily the whole church. Now, Paul is not denigrating the gift of tongues. He's not downplaying it. He says, I would like for all of you to speak in tongues. That would be fine with me. But in public gathering for worship, I would rather someone prophesy, because then the whole church can be benefited. So from that, we kind of gather that in so many times, when someone speaks in tongues, it is a private kind of prayer language. And those I know who have the gift of tongues, they often use it in their times of prayer as a prayer language. A great benefit to them and great spiritual growth. But they say it for their prayer time, and often even refer to it, as I said, as a prayer language. But prophesying is definitely for the whole congregation. You're speaking the word of the Lord. And so Paul makes that distinction in public worship, when the whole church is gathered to worship. He said, I would rather you prophesy than speak in tongues, because the whole church will be edified. Now, there's an exception to that. In verse 13, he says, "For this reason, the one who speaks in tongues should pray that they may interpret what is being said. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful, so what shall I say? I will pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, I will also sing with my understanding." So it's as if you have someone speaking in tongues in a church, then you need also someone who has the gift of interpretation. They can then interpret by the power of the Spirit what the person is saying. That way the whole church is benefited. So what happens there is, when someone is speaking in tongues and an interpreter is present, now sometimes the one who speaks in tongues also has the gift of interpretation. Sometimes it's another person. But either way, when the tongue is being interpreted by the power of the Spirit, it functions like prophecy. You see, someone speaks in a tongue and it is interpreted, and therefore it functions like prophecy, therefore it edifies the whole church. Now notice in verse 18, Paul will say, "I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you, So Paul evidently had the gift of tongues. He said, I speak in tongues. But in the church, that is in public worship, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. So Paul is talking about a gathering for public worship, and he highly values prophecy here because it benefits the whole church. And if someone does speak in tongues in a public gathering, there should be an interpreter so that the tongues might function as prophecy and therefore benefit the whole church. Again, the emphasis is on the entire congregation, the entire body, that all might be benefited. But again, Paul does not forbid tongues. In fact, he highly values it as of great benefit. And if you speak in tongues, he says, that's wonderful. I do, he says. But for the church, in public gathering, I put greater value on prophecy, for I want the entire church to be benefited. We'll continue talking about this tomorrow, and I hope you join with us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians.